Ready. Play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Talking Tennis, where I'm actually going to be speaking to an author. It's not the first author we've had on the show, but it's certainly someone who's got a unique tale to tell. Mark Cripps, who wrote Author of In Pursuit of the Slam. It's a fan's pursuit, if you like, of the Slam, although I know Mark has some tennis experience too. Mark, how are you doing today?
Hello, John. I'm fine, thanks. It's a privilege to be here talking to you. Delighted to be.
Yes, and it's a pleasure. I mean, we've been in contact for probably the best part of 8-9 months now regarding having a chat about your book. And yeah, tell us a little bit, Mark, about where the sort of idea came from and how that happened.
Well, I was this is back in the early 90s, and I was in the corporate world. I was working with American Express in marketing, corporate marketing. I've been with the company 10, 11 years, and I was working in Sydney, but I didn't have a very happy year down there. And something came to me that I really needed to make a change, do something different. And I resigned my job. But while I was working my notice, I was on a trip, on a business trip from Sydney to Perth. And it just so happened that there was an in-flight magazine, and in there was a photo of an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen for some time. And he was now living in New York. And while I was flying, the idea of me taking time out before deciding what to do next job-wise came to me. And I thought I would go and visit my friend Simon. And then the thought came to me, while I'm there, why don't I go and see the US Open? I'd been crazy about tennis for most of my life. And why not go?
What year was this exactly, and what sort of time of the year?
It was end of 1991. I was on that trip. And I thought, well, let's go home and do some traveling. But I thought, well, if I go to the US Open, that means I'll be in America for the autumn. And if I traveled around the States, then I could go back out and come back to Australia where I was. Yeah. Enjoy it without the sort of pressures of work that have been dominating my time there.
So right now, Mark, sorry, but right now it's kind of end of 91. You're sort of fed up with your working situation, and you're already looking towards the autumn of 92 for a trip, right?
Yes, but and then I thought, well, if I travel around the States and do the 90, that when I worked it out, the 1993 Australian Open. Well, okay, what will I do up until the US Open? And then it said, well, why don't I go around Europe? I'd never really traveled around Europe, doing the backpacking on the train stuff that so many had done when they were, 18, 19, 20. I mean, I was in my mid-30s at the time. But I thought, well, why don't I do that? And while I do it, make sure I'm in Paris for the French Open. And then I could come back to Wimbledon, where I owned a flat overlooking the site of the original Wimbledon and Warple Road, actually. Okay. And that would sort of make a slam. It would be a non-calendar year slam. It wouldn't, follow the Australia first model. And then I thought, well, while I'm in Europe, I could make sure I go to Rome and see the Italian Open, which is a tournament I'd always wanted to go and watch because of the amazing Foro Italico and its sunken courts and swaying trees and all of that. So that sort of plan came together in about half an hour on the flight. And that's really what I did. And it was sometime later, 2 years ago, when I'd been through many different experiences. I'd become a tennis coach and done 14 years of full-time tennis coach. And I was now working in publishing, and the idea of writing my book. I was an editor and edited other people's books. And one literally came to me. Why don't I write my own and write about that trip? And that's really where the book came from.
Great.
The trip.
So I've got the timeline now. I can see now sort of end of 91. You're sort of looking towards the autumn of 92. And then you're thinking, well, I'm going to be in Europe before then anyway, because that's where I reside. And you hadn't done a huge amount of traveling. So you thought, well, okay, Roland Garros, Wimbledon, and then the US Open. And then, of course, with going in that direction, it's one way of traveling around the globe, if you like. It's maybe not the conventional way, but this way. And also, by the way, the slam that you have achieved as a fan is actually the same one I think Novak would achieve about some 20 odd years later, when I think he wins the French Open, finishes his cycle in Melbourne as well. So yeah, cool. And then of course Rome as well. Let's begin with Rome, because there's actually one or two nice pictures as well associated with your trip. And I find myself as somebody that sort of crossed a few of these generations too. I started watching, from the Becker and Edberg era, which certainly encompasses some of the matches that you would have been to, or some of the tournaments you'd have been to as well. And I do find myself, maybe more with tennis than most other things, I find myself quite melancholic looking back at some of these images from the early 90s, because the sport has changed so much since then, some ways for the better, some ways for the worse. When you look back, and do you get those feelings as well of I don't know how to explain it, but the goosebumps almost when you're looking back at some of those images from the early 90s?
Oh, definitely. I mean,
even
because
on the camera, actually, you would have taken a camera with you, of course, and taken some of these pictures yourself, right?
I was a bit like when I sat there in the Foro Italico on the first day. I mean, it's such an atmospheric place with the sunken courts. You go in at ground level, and there are these banks of courts. That site has changed quite considerably and been developed in the 30 years I was there. But the outside courts are there down there. They're cut down into the grounds, and just sitting there watching clay. It was probably the first top clay court tennis that I'd actually seen, other than on television, of course. So the first clay court stuff I'd seen live, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were at that tournament, Jim Courier was world number one, and he was playing at that tournament. But I'd always been interested in players a little bit further down the rankings too. So I write about in the book, but watching Ronald Agenor and Jaime Izaga and a lot of the doubles as well. Some of the unsung players on the tour playing on clay in the heat, and that was absolutely wonderful.
Actually, the heat is going to be a topic that will appear from time to time, because, of course, tennis is always played in pretty much the peak of every summer, wherever it is in the world. And that's why, maybe Wimbledon a bit less so, but some of these European tournaments, the US and, of course, Australian swings can get very, very hot. But we'll touch on that as we progress. Tell us about that Rome tournament. What are your memories and matches that you saw?
Well, as I said, I mean, the beauty also of the way the courts, those outdoor courts, are laid out, is that you can be sitting watching one match going on in front of you, but if you shift your seat over, you can take in the match going on the next court, the next two banks of well. So, you can take in and watch lots of different players. One memory, which I mention in the book also, is about the passion of the Italian fans for their players. And there were 6 or 7 Italians playing in that tournament. Claudio Pistolesi and I can't remember, Pozzi, Gianluca Pozzi, I think, was playing. And the Italian crowd was so passionate. And if those players won, the exhilarated reaction from the crowd was tremendous. But if those players lost, then they weren't happy as well. So, watching, and that was lesser or more extent, to greater extent, that was the case in Paris as well. Certainly, of course, at Wimbledon, we know about the focus on the British players at Wimbledon. So maybe that was not uncommon in all the locations I went to. But there were other players. Thierry Champion comes to mind. And of course, Jim, I remember going to the back of the site where the practice courts were and watching Jim Courier practice, and was working so hard. And bearing in mind the heat, the first thing I noticed was that he didn't have a shirt on, and I had sunscreen plastered all over me, and there he was, just with a shirt, in shorts and socks and shoes, yes, playing for hours and hours and hours. I also remember the over 35s event that was there, and there were a number of players that from the previous decade I had watched a lot on television. Guillermo Vilas was there, Peter Fleming was there, and rather poignantly, Vitas Viralitis was there, and there's a photo. Yes, who was playing in both the singles and the doubles. So it was an interesting mix of obviously players who were on the ACP tour at the time, versus the ones who'd sort of pretty much just left it, But were still fantastic players. I mean, Guillermo Vilas was renowned for in the days when he was being coached by Jan Turiak, to be out there on the practice court for hour after hour after hour with Turiak, taking one practice partner off and putting another one on, and he did quite a bit of that while I was there. So,
of course,
so many of players.
Courier went on to win the tournament, I believe, beating Ivanisevic in the final, and this was his almost domain. The clay was certainly, and you've got two opposite ends of the scale there in terms of Ivanisevic would have been very much looking forward to the Wimbledon that was upcoming, which I think if we're talking about 92, of course, he was to get to the final too, but we'll probably come to that in a short while. Okay. Any other final memories of the Italian Open before we do then switch our attention to Roland Garros?
Yeah, I mean, other players are coming to mind, Jakub Slazek and Marc Rosset. I mean, there are so many names, but and I didn't manage to get in to see the men's final, unfortunately, but somebody handed me a ticket and I managed to get in to see the doubles final. Mark Kratzmann, I think, was the Australian was
okay. So someone just sort of handed you a ticket on the way out, as actually still happens today sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, I mean, some of the tournaments now, it's much more structured and organised at Wimbledon, with queues here and queues there, and you've got to do it. So yeah, it was quite flexible. But dealing with the heat, I had to get to the site in order to be sure to get in. I had to get to the site each morning at 9 o'clock in order to stand in a little queue. It was nothing like the Wimbledon queue, either then or especially now, and buy a ground pass. But the actual tennis didn't start till 11. So I went back to my little hotel and rested with a fan on, and then back out again to watch the tennis for 6-7 hours, finishing with the doubles, and then off for some lovely Italian food somewhere in Rome.
And of course, this was the beginning of your sort of slam thing. Did you have any kind of anxieties? I mean, you said about taking time off work, and there's obviously the financial pressures that come with this. Were you a bit sort of anxious at the beginning of your trip, or were you always full of gusto and enjoyment?
No, I was. I mean, I'd been fortunate that I'd done quite well in American Express, and certainly before I'd ended up in Sydney, I'd worked in the Middle East. I was director for the Middle East region, and that was a pretty well paid job, and I'd been able to put away a bit of money. So funnily enough, the finances were the least of my issues. If anything, I thought about it was, even from the early stages of the trip, I said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do afterwards? I didn't really do, but I tried to be in the moment with it, and certainly as I was traveling, and certainly when I was in Rome, you could do nothing else really.
So let's move on to the French Open. This will be I'm guessing had you been to Wimbledon many times before this, or was this the first time you'd even been to a slam?
Yeah, many times. I've been many times to Wimbledon. Yes.
You've been in the 80s to Wimbledon many times then?
Yeah. Again, I opened the book by talking about the first chapter of the book's called Telegram for Roger Taylor, because, I mean, as I've discovered since writing the book, there are a lot of people like me whose love for the sport, it was passed on via someone else. And in plenty of cases, it's people's mothers. And in my case, it was my dear mother, who was crazy about tennis. And every year in the 60s, used to enter the ballot and always seemed to get tickets. And she would go and then bring us back those old programs from the 60s with the black and white photo on the front and the different colored borders. And in 68, I was 12 years old, and she took me, I think it was the middle Saturday of the 68 Wimbledon. And I just, was completely blown away by it. We were on centre court and finished the day with a fantastic doubles match. I remember it now. I can see it now. The great Lou Hode playing with Owen Davidson, who I would meet later on in the trip in the States of the fantasy camp I ended up at. Playing against Marty Reeson and Tom Ocker, who were, top singles players, but were also one of the very top doubles teams in the world, and that was a fantastic 5-set match. In fact, I remember meeting when I met Marty, because I met Marty as well as Owen Davidson, and I was introduced to him, and I told him that story. This is 1992, so however many years later, 24 years later, and I said I was there, by the way, and the first time I ever went to Wimbledon, and I explained, and he looked at me and said, "Lost 6-4 in the fifth." And he remembered the match like it was yesterday.
Yeah. Looking back, actually, just before we do move on to the French Open of '92, looking back at tennis, how it was in those days and compared to, say, how it is today, what are the things that you think are different or that you miss, or is it still just the same? What are your feelings about the sport today compared to then?
Sense, the atmosphere is pretty similar. I mean, there are some that would say that the sport, the actual play itself, has become a little homogenized, and and I probably would side with that view. And that is mainly, as I see it, as a result of changes to rackets, but especially to the strings. I remember reading about how the strings had been changed and evolved, certainly in the early 2000s. One article talked about how, you know, you could put 4 times the work into a ground stroke. For the same effort that you put into a ground stroke with the old strings versus the new strings. With the new strings, you could get 4 times as much output. So, you know, that has, and also there are those that say the courts have been slowed down, the balls have been slowed down. So, you know, you see now, as we have seen in over the last 2 weeks in Melbourne, that these days players serve, go back onto the baseline, and start playing out baseline tennis. Whereas you certainly didn't see that at Wimbledon back in '92, and less so in the US and the Australian Open too. Of course, in Paris and at Rome, it was more traditional, what you might call clay court tennis, where it did go. You did play from the back. So the playing styles definitely has evolved and changed. But, you know, that was all in the context. Any changes that have been made, and I remember the wonderful Fred Stolle at one of the fantasy camps that I ended up going on to years after the trip, telling a group of us how even in the '60s people were complaining of that. Then the crowds were getting fed up with serve volley tennis because the courts were too fast, not too slow. You know, and certainly after the Second World War, when there was a profusion of tall, strong college players coming over from the States, you know, serving and volleying. You know, that was what was going on then. Now you rarely see. Remember a statistic about Roger Federer that in the early 2000s, when he started, he would probably serve and volley on pretty much 100% of his first serves, and pretty much 75 to 80% of his second serves. But 10 to 12 years on, he rarely serve volleyed at all. And alone sort of sums up one of the biggest difference, I would say. In terms of atmosphere, I think, you know, the excitement and the interest, pretty much the same.
Fair enough. Okay, French Open '92. You've obviously had your sort of first clay court tournament experience as a fan in Rome, and now you're heading into the '92 French Open. And tell us about some of the names and some of the anticipation and just how you enjoyed that tournament.
Oh, well, I mean, an interesting thing happened on the very first day that I went. I managed to get a ticket. Someone was selling a ticket, a ground pass, and I bought it, not for too much money. I walked through the gate, and the first person I saw was Claire Wood, who was one of the young British pros of the time. And I'd known Claire from playing tennis at the Southdown Club in Lewes through the '80s, when I'd been working for American Express in Brighton and living. And she said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I've come to watch the tennis." And she very kindly, she said, "Well, look, as long as I'm in the tournament, I'll leave you a ticket every day." So and she did that, and I'm forever thankful to her for that. So that was a nice start. And
how long did you stay in the tournament for?
Well, I remember I don't think she wasn't in the singles. I don't think she managed to qualify in the singles, but she played into doubles and mixed doubles quite far into the second week. So, you know, that enabled me to keep going on, you know, almost through the tournament. I mean, my memory is that I couldn't get a ticket sadly for the 2 finals, but I did see the semi-finals. So it was that was a wonderful thing to happen. Michael Chang, I remember from that tournament. I mean, I actually opened the book with talking about the prologue of the book, talking about the most fantastic match between Nicholas Kulti, the young Swede, and Chang, and Kulti. Nicholas Kulti won that in the 5th set, and that was played on the old bullring court. I don't know if you remember the bullring court.
No.
It's been knocked down, and the third show court is sort of taken Roland Garros has taken the place of the bullring, but it had a wonderful atmosphere, and it was packed to the rafters, and it was the middle Saturday, and I managed to get in there. And Chang, who was a seeded player, of course, he had already won the French Open 2 years before, I think, he was fighting for his life, but and kept coming back, but ultimately Kulti won, and the crowd went absolutely berserk. That was fantastic. I didn't know that 2 days on, I would manage to walk up the stairs for the Philippe Chatrier, and one of the ushers said to me, "Your ticket?" And I said, "I haven't got a ticket." He said, "Oh, come on in," and he just let me go in and watch. And there was Nicholas Kulti playing his next match against Henri Lecomte, who of course was the star of the
absolutely
time. And again, in another amazing 5-set match. This time, Nicholas Kulti lost. He couldn't keep it going, and rather like yesterday with Yannick Sinner's comeback, Henri had come back from, I think, 2-1 down, and he certainly won the 4th set. Again, the crowd went berserk.
I would like to know, Mark, about the crowd, especially for this match. I mean, the French crowd are kind of well known for their vociferous support.
Yes, really, really amazing. Another match I remember on the bullring court, not quite so packed as the Chang Kulti match was, and I could pick my seat, and I decided to sit quite low down, court level, watching a young Pete Sampras playing against Charlie Stieb, the German player, top 20 player, Davis Cupper. And Pete Sampras won that, but that was a wonderful experience, watching it, sitting at ground level, watching them move, watching how they hit the ball. You could see the spins, the different shape of the ball almost. That was absolutely wonderful. I watched a lot of doubles as well when I was there, and I remember, there's a lot of focus now on Ben Shelton, the American youngster. Well, I watched his dad, Brian, playing. Of course, he was a very good singles player and men's doubles player, but he was playing with Laurie McNeil, and they did very, very well. And I decided to sort of attach my spectator badge to them and watch them. And they did very well certainly they did very well in Paris, playing mixed doubles. I remember watching Mary Pierce play doubles. Again, so many of them. So it's sort of the players that I'd watched in Rome, I would then try and follow them again in Paris. As well as add on other ones that I would watch, and that helped me decide each day what I wanted to watch. I mean, it was pretty fine to sort of wander around the courts, and there were times when I did that, but at least having some attachment to some of the players that I'd watched already, I could say, well, right, Nicholas Kulti's playing, let's go and watch his match. And of course, Claire, when if ever Claire Wood was playing, I'd watch her play in women's doubles and in the mixed. I sat, and another interesting experience was that I didn't know him at the time, but watching Claire's matches was Andrew Jarrett, who of course who's a former player himself, who became the Wimbledon referee, recently published a book himself, actually. And I sat with him and his family, and he was watching the British players, and that was a little slice of experience from home, in the middle of all the French people.
Mark, do you have so having now been to the French, and of course later you would go on to complete the calendars, or sorry, the pursuit of the Slam, we're going to all of them. Do you have a particular tournament that you think from a fan's perspective was your favorite? I mean, do you, or even just from that year that you were there, a tournament that excited you the most?
Well, I've been asked, John, that question, and It's a difficult one to answer because they were all, they were all, again, I put this comment in the book that all of the tournaments were sort of a reflection. It's an obvious thing to say perhaps, but they were a reflection of the place that they were in. And they were all, they were similar. And after a while, after you've been 1 and 2, then you know how it all works and so on. And the draw and how the events work through first week, second week, and the start of the juniors and the greater focus on outside courts of the doubles, all that sort of thing. But of course, you were in a different environment each time. Paris is unique in its own way, just like New York is, and Rome, of course. So I had the combination of the experiences in the city, both before and after play each day, along with the actual tennis at the site. So they were all, and I wouldn't say carried away with the experience, but there were times when I couldn't quite believe I was doing it. It was just an idea on a plane 6 months prior, and here I was actually doing it. I just tried to enjoy the moment and enjoy each place. I mean, I had been to Wimbledon before, so perhaps I don't know, the law of diminishing returns fits in that. But I mean, that's a terrible thing to say about Wimbledon. Wimbledon is magnificent.
It is, but we're both from the UK, so the excitement of going on holiday and visiting somewhere else and being in a foreign land. Listen, we all have our own biases, but probably towards Wimbledon as British people, French for the French Open. But actually, I probably get a little bit more excited about when I do visit, like New York. Maybe would be the one that I would answer if asked that same question as a fan, just because it's New York, right? It's a holiday. London is great, but London I go to 10 times a year.
I think maybe it's a question of new experiences, but these were all, brand new experiences. I mean, much though I enjoyed the Wimbledon. I mean, the wonderful thing about Wimbledon was, of course, that I was back living in my flat, which is just short of a couple of miles away, the Warple Road site. I could walk every day and go and watch it. And, it was there was an evolving experience as well, but by watching the players. This is what I mentioned before about my attachment to these players. And who was playing here? Byron Talbot and Brad Pearce were a doubles team that I started following, and so I watched them in Rome, and then carried on watching them through. And so, all of these experiences added to each individual tournament's experience. There's certainly there's not one where I could say, oh, without a shadow of a doubt, that was the best tournament, and forget about the others. No, it was not like that at all. I loved every minute of it, and tried to enjoy what was on offer that was unique from each of the places I was in, both away from the site and on the site.
So, of course, on the men's singles side, Jim Courier beat Petr Korda in the final to get his second Grand Slam, but singles title. But maybe it was the women's final that is still talked about to this day between Monica Seles and Steffi Graf, which famously I think was 10-8 in the third set, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which sadly I couldn't get a ticket for, but in the little bed and breakfast hotel I was staying in, there was a bar 2 doors down, and they had a massive TV. So ironically, I watched that one on TV. But yeah,
but you're still there. I mean, I know what you mean. I've watched I've been to tournaments and haven't been able always to see the best matches and stuff. But so sometimes even just you go to a bar and you watch. I remember watching Coco Gauff against Iga Swiatek a couple of years ago because I was going to the men's final the following day. But that's how it is. You can't go to every match all the time. You can't get tickets all the time. But yeah, what a final that was. So you remember watching that in a French bar?
Yes, as I watched Jim Courier play Petr Korda.
Yeah. But that Monica Seles 10-8 is still talked about as to this day, and it's in the conversation of greatest Grand Slam singles finals ever.
Well, I was fortunate, and I've just posted this on social media that over the weekend, as Aryna Sabalenka, sort of powered her way to victory, is that back in '93, I was fortunate. I did get tickets for the final in both men's and women's finals, and the women's final was again another matchup between Monica Seles and Steffi Graf.
So hang on a second. If you went to the French Open singles finals in '93, you did 5 Grand Slams in a row, right?
Sorry, '92. No, sorry. Start again. because sorry, they played the final in '92, but they played the Australian Open final in '93.
Got it. Oh, I see. Yeah, we'll come to that, I'm sure, very shortly. But yeah, okay, yeah.
Stands for that, and sideways on, and to see Graf, Graf. Sometimes people say, "Oh, Steffi didn't, couldn't play a topspin backhand," and well, she could, but she just chose to hit a slice more often than not, which was more about placing the ball and keeping her opponent back, and then attacking them with her forehand, her aggressive forehand. But she could hit a double-handed backhand, and it was wonderful sitting sideways on, watching Monica hit with two hands off both sides, these pounding ground strokes, and Steffi both defending, but trying to position Monica into the right place so that Steffi could unleash her own, powerful forehand. That was wonderful stuff. I really, that's a strong memory, that final.
I mean, so this period as well for Monica was all, of course, just in the build-up to her unfortunate stabbing in Hamburg. So that would have been, so we had the French Open final, which we just touched upon, where she won 10-8 in the third against Steffi Graf. And she was the top-ranked woman pretty much for a large period of this time. And I think she won the Australian Open in '93 as well, that you were just touching upon just then, didn't she?
Francia Sanchez Vicario in New York.
Yeah. She won three. She won 3 of the 4 slams that you went to.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the only one you win was Wimbledon. But anyway, so just before you sort of elaborate on that, so then that builds up all the way to so she wins the French Open, she wins the US Open, she wins Australia, and then 2 or 3 months after the Australian Open, that's when she gets stabbed in Hamburg, and her career was obviously derailed from there.
It was. I hadn't thought in my mind that it was later, but it was the 30th of April, so very shortly after that. Yeah,
because the Australian Open would have been end of January, I guess, right?
30th of April it was. Yeah.
And the Australian Open would have been end of January, so it's like 2 or 3 months after you saw her, win that Grand Slam. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of ourselves. Let's move on now to the UK, which obviously follows in the calendar after that French swing, the clay court swing that obviously culminates in the French Open. Tell us about, because obviously you went to Wimbledon, but you also did some other things before that, right?
Yeah, it was always my plan. I did a bit of sort of what one might call normal tourist things in France. I was always interested in history. I'd done a degree in history and politics, and I was interested in the First World War. So I went to the Somme and Verdun, the battlefields of those areas, and that took up sort of 4 days after the Roland Garros finished. But of course,
hang on a second, Mark, just stop me a second. This is '92, right?
Yeah.
And I'm guessing about June time, yeah?
Yes.
Because I went on a school trip to the battlefields of Somme and Ypres, the exact same year, the exact same summer. I couldn't put a date on it, but it would have been June or July, and it was baking hot, and the French farmers were on strike. And I remember the bus just stuck in traffic for about 6 hours.
Well, I mean, I was always going to do that, but I mean, of course, now we have 3 weeks between the end of Roland Garros,
yeah,
Wimbledon, not the qualies, but the main draw, the main event. Back then, of course, it was we were still in the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there were tournaments going on. I think Queens was that week. Back in the UK now, Queens was that week. Also, the tournament up at Birmingham at the Priory, Edgbaston Priory Club, which was the warm-up tournament. So I sort of missed those, although followed them. But it was the following week in the build-up, the second week prior to the start of Wimbledon. And on the Monday I went, and again I mapped this out in one of the early chapters in the book. What I did, got up early and on the train down to Eastbourne, the wonderful Devonshire Park at Eastbourne, to watch the women play for a day. And again, many of the players that I'd now, certainly I'd seen in Paris. Claire was there, I think. Laurie McNeil was there. Linda Harvey-Wild did particularly well. That's the name from the past. She was doing well. Jana Vopna, all the great names from that time were playing there. Eastbourne was a strong tournament. But that was a day trip. Leave very early, get back very late. And the very next day, I went, again, up really early, up to Euston in London, and on the train up to Manchester, to the famous, quite famous, Northern Club. Wimbledon of the North, as it's often been called. In years gone by, it was called that. And there was again the ATP Tour build-up tournament was going on there. Ultimately won, I think, by Jacco Elting, the Dutch player, and Jeremy.
This is the Manchester Open, right?
Yeah, Jacco Elting, Jeremy Bates was there,
Okay.
and all these types of players, highly ranked, but slightly lower ranked than the top.
Yeah. And of course, it was on grass as well. It was all part of it was a sort of traditional part of the Wimbledon build-up.
Yeah, and it was actually at that tournament, sitting in the sun. I got there, I was up really early on an early train, 2.5 hours on a bus, and then I'm there sitting in a seat at about 11 o'clock, on the centre court as the first match comes out. And it was then that I started to think about, I had another sort of stream of consciousness, a bit like I'd had on that flight from Sydney to Perth, about what I wanted to do. I suddenly thought, well, I love tennis. I'm traveling around watching it. Why don't I do something that, can replicate that? And I had the idea for a few hours, at least, of becoming an official, an umpire or a line judge. By the time I got back down to Houston, I'd realised, no, I'd coaching. And I sort of effectively, that was an important day because I effectively made that decision that I would try and become a club tennis coach when the trip was over. And actually, on the platform at Houston, something I write about in the book, something made me turn around as I was walking down the platform, having got off the train. Something made me turn around, and I saw a player who was clearly a player with a massive, great Prince bag, and I recognised him. And this was Byron Talbot, the doubles player who I'd been watching in Rome. And I waited for him. Said, "You're Byron Talbot, aren't you?" And we travelled across Wimbledon to Wimbledon together on the London Underground. I'm still in touch with him now.
It's a funny thing in tennis that maybe non-tennis fans or tennis fans that don't regularly go to tournaments realize is actually bumping into players is something that happens. I mean, if you go to Wimbledon itself or any of the slams, actually, you can just be there as a fan because they've got it's not like most sports where the players and stuff are cocooned and that they leave the stadium and then they're in the dressing room and then they're in the bus and they're gone. At Wimbledon and all the other slams, I think, and pretty much all the tournaments I've been to, the players they've got to walk onto the court, and because they're all, you've got 15 courts or whatever all there, and so they've got to go from one court to the next, or they've got to exit the place, and bumping into them either around Wimbledon during the tournament or between the courts, etc. It's very common. So you'll just be there, and there's like, I remember this happening to me a couple of years ago. Oh, there's Goran Ivanisevic. Oh, there's Arina Sabalenka. And they're walking past you with their bags. They're either, maybe they've just been playing an hour before, or they've just been practicing half an hour before, or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. I made a point on an internet forum I'm on about how, some people think maybe that's a bit strange, and wouldn't they be worried in the context of what happened to Monica Seles? But of course, as they're developing, from the very young age these days, 8, 9, 10, playing mini tennis tournaments and then on to full court tournaments and so on, all the way through their years, they're accessible. They're wandering around the club. They're playing their match. They come off. They go and have something to eat. That's quite normal for them. And then even when they go onto the low tiers of the tour, ITF events, and then what used to be called, futures events, and then into Challenger and so on, they wandering around is almost quite normal. Probably now at the slams. I mean, again, I don't know, but I imagine that's a trend more so today. It certainly was back then, that the players are sort of cocooned and restricted.
But actually, I still see them. I mean, I don't recall maybe Novak or Rafa, but I've seen these players. I mean, because they can't. There isn't especially if you're not playing on the center court, for example. There may be no other way of you. So you're practicing, for example, on court 17. Okay, you've got to leave the court, and there's not you might have some security people around you. Like I say, for Novak and Rafa, maybe Roger too, but pretty much the rest of the tour, you'll see the number 5 in the world, and they might not have as much attention because don't forget that 50% of the average going tennis fan, especially at the slams, probably doesn't even know who the number 7 in the world is, So actually you do see them because they've got to. They've got. There's only you when you come off a tennis court. There's no tunnel.
No
tunnel. So they've got to come through the fans, and that. Yeah.
I don't know. I could be corrected on this, but it's a memory from the way Flinders Park was built. I mean, that was what the Australian Open site was called back then. I know it's not called that now, but that there were some underground passageways that had been built so players could be brought in, almost like it was some sort of spy headquarters or something.
I mean, maybe tournament to tournament's different. I mean, I've probably been to about a third of the tour. I've been to the Australian Open, but just once. But most of the other tournaments, yeah. I remember the US Open, seeing the juniors champion, who's a Filipino girl, Yala, saw her just walking past, and yeah, you do see them, especially because of the maybe centre court or Arthur Ashe. There's lots of ways in and out without mixing with the fans, but most of the others, yeah.
We're moving on through the year, but if I could just take one half step back,
sure.
Again, anecdote I write about in the book was at Roland Garros. I'm wandering around the outside courts in the second week, and I see this very well dressed older woman with a maroon beret, smiling and looking lovingly at a player who was on the court. And I thought, I wonder who that is. There was no one else really watching, and I went and looked, and it's John McEnroe.
Yeah.
McEnroe was playing in the doubles with Andre Agassi that tournament, and I think they got to the quarterfinals. And there he was, and he wasn't. He always said he didn't like practicing, would far rather play the doubles tournament than practice. But there he was actually playing. One of the photos in the book is one I surreptitiously took of him. He didn't. I don't think he minded. I don't think he knew, but. I probably could have called, "Hey, John," if I'd wanted to. I didn't. I let him play, but I left him well alone. But
yeah. Okay, so yeah, Wimbledon. What are your memories of Wimbledon '92? I mean, I let a bit of the cat out of the bag in terms of what happened that year, in terms of Ivanisevic's run. I do remember this tournament myself. It was the Agassi Ivanisevic men's singles final, and Agassi had his story regarding Wimbledon as well. In '92 and the years that preceded that, he had a love-hate relationship that ultimately ended in love. What are your memories of that tournament that year as a fan?
Again, lots of wandering around the outside courts, lots of doubles. Watching the likes of Jim Grab and Richie Renneberg, who played. That was the Wimbledon. That the rain was so bad. This was before. I mean, people that were not around or were not following the sport at that time. This was where you had the current centre court, but it wasn't really anything like the centre court is now, with this sort of elevated. Like the capacity is much greater. There are a roof and floodlights that didn't exist back then, and you had again. This was prior to the brand new number one. I call it brand new. It's going to be coming up to 30 years old now. The current number one court. It was the old number one court. And I remember over the weekend, the rain was so bad that all the finals got sort of affected. Certainly the scheduling got affected. If not in the case of Steffi Graf and Monica Seles, I think there were 3 interruptions to their final, which. Benefit, so they say. I mean, there benefited Steffi more than it did Monica, but they had to take some of the doubles finals into the Monday, and you could, if you got in the queue, you could get in free and go on number one court. And there's some wonderful clips on YouTube of Grab and Renneberg playing Michael Stich and John McEnroe, who won the tournament that year, and of course Stich won the singles the previous year.
That's right, yeah.
So again, lots of doubles, and that quite brutal match between the doubles pair in Paris of John McEnroe and Andre Agassi, with Agassi just hitting the ball. I mean, talk about the power now, and sure, with the rackets they hit the ball incredibly hard, but just have a look back. They hit the ball pretty hard back then. I mean, this was the evolutionary developments I've talked about before in strings, but it was about McEnroe's brilliant ability at the net, trying to anticipate and Agassi's just thunderous passing shots, if not just sort of general ground strokes. So wonderful stuff, wonderful.
Was it a sort of a weather affected tournament? Did it affect your experience as well?
My memory is that the weather got worse as the tournament went on, and it certainly wasn't hot as Rome had been, or New York, or Melbourne would be. I was getting there at sort of 8 o'clock every morning and getting in at 10:30, 10:45. But and I remember being completely worn out by the end of it. I was pretty fit and healthy in those days, but I walked 2 miles to the ground, stood in the queue for 2 hours, watched tennis for 8-9 hours for the best part of 2 weeks. I remember when the finals came. Again, sadly, I couldn't get a ticket for the final. You can get tickets, but I think the price for the tickets was a little bit high for me. And I thought, let's just watch those at home, which I did. But,
and of course, you're also still closer to the beginning of your sort of slam trip anyway. So you've got plenty of other things to come.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Did you were you telling people as well? Were you talking to people when you were at these tournaments, especially say Wimbledon, where you were sort of saying, by the way, I'm going to go to New York as well? And I mean, this point, by the way, of course, as you touched on at the beginning, you didn't have any ideas about writing a book about it. It was just a personal trip, right?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, there was no social media. I mean, immediately you're asking me that question, I'm thinking, did I tell anyone about it? I mean, of course, my family, sure. And maybe close friends. But now, if I did that trip now, I mean, I've followed some people, I think on Twitter or X, whatever we call it now, who are doing similar sorts of things, not exactly the way I did it, but in their own way. And of course, that goes out to the world on social media.
Yeah.
Back in 1993. So I mean, and even going to tournaments, I don't think I told too many. I just sort of did it.
You didn't see, apart from players, you didn't see any sort of fans reappear at any of the tours. You didn't see someone at Wimbledon, then 9 months later see them in Australia.
No, absolutely not. No. That's again. It was everything was quite sort of self-contained for that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't. Of course, I wasn't in the media, so I knew who some of the journalists. So I remember talking to a couple of the Fleet Street journalists in Roland Garros at one of the coffee stands where we were both getting another baguette and a cup of coffee, and I just started. I recognised their English accents, and I said, "Oh, you guys, we had a chat," but I don't think I ever saw them. I didn't see them again. Of course, they were there, but they were in the middle doing their job.
Yeah. Do you have any recollections across these tournaments that we've just highlighted, whether it be Rome, Paris, or Wimbledon, or anywhere else, of any fan experiences? Did you see anyone dressed up crazily or chat to random people? Because I think you were going to most of these tournaments kind of on your own, right?
I was. Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, no. That wasn't really an aspect of it.
You didn't see a French fan dressed as a baguette or a British fan dressed as a beefeater or anything? Americano
2/3 full. No, not really. I was sort of both trying to experience it and stand back and observe it at the same time.
Okay, listen, Mark, I think if we're coming towards the end of the sort of Wimbledon part, I think we can probably, because time is getting on, I think we'll probably stop here and then we'll record the other parts some of the time. What we'll do then for the next time we talk is we'll go post Wimbledon, which I think is your Italy experience, right? And that obviously then leads us into the US Open Tennis Fantasy Camp. And if that works, we'll try and get all the Australia in as well. But we can maybe even split it into 3 if we run on. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.